So, everybody, thank you for joining the second session of the third day of our Enterprise UX Virtual Summit. Today, we've got Ryan Vandermeer here, who is a product manager at WildBit, and he has a lot of experience in enterprise design and product management. He wrote the book Making It Right, which is a fantastic book available on Amazon, and I will drop in the link in the chat box as well. But today, he's here to really talk about how he has approached and executed on enterprise user research, which can be a huge challenge and pain point for folks. So with that being said, Ryan, I'll pass this over to you and you can get it started.
Great, thanks so much. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. So good morning from Portland, Oregon, where we haven't seen the sun in months, which isn't an exaggeration. So things are rough. I had to buy a UV lamp, the whole deal. It's been quite the winter. If anyone's here from Portland, shout out to you guys, and we should form a group. This is super weird because usually when you do a talk, you can at least see if your jokes fall flat, and in this kind of environment, and you can adjust. So in this kind of environment, I'm just gonna assume you guys are always laughing at all the jokes, and I'll just keep going as if this is the best thing you've ever seen, since I can't see anyone's reactions. So I am, my name is Rian. I'm what I just told Ben, I would consider myself a recovering enterpriser, since I'm at WildBit now, and we don't do enterprise software. We build tools for developers. So you might be familiar with some of the stuff that we make. Beanstalk, which is kind of like GitHub, and I'm product manager for a product called Postmark, which is for transactional email. So that's what I'm doing right now. But before that, I spent a lot of time at enterprises in a variety of roles. I started at eBay as a user researcher, and then later on moved into the product side. So when I talk about user research and the challenges and solutions for the enterprise, I come at it not just as a researcher, but also as someone who has been on the side of consuming research and needing it to fulfill my product-related job. So that's what I'm going to try to talk about today, is some of those things that I've learned both as a researcher and as a consumer of research within a large enterprise. What are some of the things that are more useful and most useful to me? But I want to start with a story about space. It's always nice to start any talk with a story about space. Who doesn't love that? The video you see here is an instruction video on how the lunar module for the Apollo missions were put together. And the reason I want to start with this story is if you read up on how the Apollo missions came about, and particularly how the lunar module was built, it sounds like the perfect enterprise project. It had impossible requirements, it had insane timelines, and it had a very limited budget. And that sounds like every single enterprise project I ever did. Impossible requirements, insane timelines, and limited budget. This thing had to provide transport for astronauts to the moon. It had to provide a self-sufficient place for working and living. The interior space couldn't be larger than a car, basically. It had to provide protection, flight and work equipment, air, food, clothing, whatever the space equivalent of bathrooms are. I tried not to Google that too much, and all the other things that you might need. So there were three modules: the command module, the service module, and the lunar module, which was used to land on the moon. And they did a traditional RFP, 9 designs were put forward, and the winning concept came from a company called Grumman Aerospace. And if you start looking at how this thing was designed, and the UI challenges that they had to deal with as well, it becomes very interesting to look at it from an enterprise UX perspective. So if you, for example, look at the command module main control panel, this looks like the software all of us use to in enterprises to submit our time off, our PTO, for example, or it looks very similar to the interfaces we see in enterprises sometimes. And this is what it actually looked like. And if you look at a photo of the model itself, they had to spend a lot of time here. and they had to know how all these things work, obviously. And this is quite the UI. So on the left side, you had the commission commanders panel, which included velocity, altitude, attitude indicators, primary flight controls. And then the command model pilot was also the navigator. So he was at the center, and his control panel has the guidance and navigation computer controls, the caution and warning indicator panels, event timers, and a bunch of different stuff. And then the lunar module pilot was the guy on the right. He was also the systems engineer. And so his control panel included cell gauges, electrical controls, battery controls, communication controls. And then flanking the sides, when you see on the far left and the far right, were a set of smaller controls. There were circuit breaker panels, audio controls, and a bunch of different things. So in total, what you look at here, you have 24 instruments, 566 switches, 40 event indicators, and 71 lights. And you might ask yourself what this has to do with enterprise software, but I've always liked looking at this and how they were actually able to land on the moon with this thing, because this is an incredible feat of UI design and enterprise design to keep these people alive. And I always feel better. When I was still doing enterprise design and research, I felt like, well, this is hard, but at least someone won't die if I put a UI control in the wrong spot, which is obviously what would have happened here. So this is obviously the hardest thing you can design, but it brings me to the point that I want to try to make here, is that enterprise design is hard, and sometimes you want to pull your hair out because of it, because there are a lot of challenges that working in smaller companies and with smaller timelines and fewer stakeholders and all that kind of stuff don't have to deal with. Enterprise design is hard. And the main reason it's hard is that when you start with a small company or you work in a small company, as researchers, as UX people, we keep our focus on user needs and business goals. That's why we do research. That's why we do what we do, is we want to make sure that we provide the user needs so that product managers and others can make the decisions about the business goals and how to connect that. The problem is that as your company grows, unfortunately, your focus shifts from those things to a bunch of different things. You start talking to a big customer that needs a specific thing to happen. Or you add a marketing department that now needs very different things. Or you add an advertising department that now needs to do stuff that flies 100% against what the user needs might be. So our jobs become a lot harder as companies grow because of this, because of the fact that we're not able to focus completely on user needs and business goals anymore. And that is obviously a danger for us, but there's an antidote, luckily. And that antidote, I've always felt, is user research. And the fact that if we are able to do user research effectively in an enterprise organization, we're able to bring that focus back on where it's supposed to be, which is user need and business goals. Now, this isn't easy. It's not an easy solution, but it is the only solution I've found, is to say, as we see things scatter into different silos in different areas, this is the one thing that can bring us back to where we're supposed to be, is user research. So we're going to talk about three things today. First, why it's hard to get support for user research in enterprises, why it's not always easy to just say, let's do some usability testing, or let's go out and do customer interviews. Then we're going to talk about how to actually sell the value of user research. So even though it's hard, there are ways to sell the value, particularly in the context of a large enterprise, that makes it easier. And then just finally some tips, how to improve insight generation of user research in enterprises. So those are the three things that we're going to talk about. Usually I would ask, are we good? Like, are we ready to go? And I'm going to assume everyone's shouting, yes, we're absolutely ready to go. So let's start with why it's hard to get support for user research in enterprises. The first thing is that we hear a lot of people say, when we bring it up, it takes too long and it costs too much. That is probably the number one thing that we all hear, is we can't do usability testing. We can't go out and talk to customers because it takes too long and it costs too much. Of course, the good thing about user research is that it shrinks to fit, and that is often the response that I have for that kind of complaint, that it takes too long and it costs too much, is that yes, it's going to cost a lot to do a week-long usability study and hiring a recruiting firm and a place to and a usability lab. But you know what's not going to take cost as much is to go to a coffee shop and ask some people to look over your shoulder at your laptop and give you feedback. So a great way we'll talk about this more later, but a great way to at least start getting some kind of user research into an organization is to start that small, is to bring it into a project in a way that doesn't cost a lot and doesn't take too long, and then use some of those insights to show the value, and that's how it's going to keep growing, and how people are going to see the value. The other question I like to ask is to throw this around when people say, well, we can't do it because it costs too much. I love to ask, what could happen if we don't do this research? How much would it cost us, not necessarily in money, but in time and development effort? How much would it cost us if we don't do research right now? And that question is kind of scary when people start to think about it, because it's expensive to build products without research. The time that you think you save from skipping that phase almost always comes back to haunt you later on. And I've seen this multiple times, where there's that famous quote about how in enterprises, why do we never have time to do it right, but we always have time to do it over? And I saw this a lot of times when I was on the agency side as well, is that uh, uh, people would come to us as a UX firm, and we would recommend research, and they wouldn't go for it. And then a year later, we would see them again and say, okay, fine, we went with these other guys, and that didn't really work. So let's do some research. So that's a good question to ask, is what could happen if we don't do this research? What are the dangers of not doing this? We might build the wrong product. We might build something that no one wants. And that is a real danger and a much larger cost than spending a little time and cost on doing research upfront. The second thing you often hear, particularly enterprises and people who have been promoted to very important titles, is that we know what's best. We've done this, we're in this industry, we don't need to talk to customers, we know what's best. And because the thing is that most enterprises still work in kind of old ways of product development. There's a lot of waterfall still. It's always funny to me how development teams tend to, even in enterprises, tend to work agile, meaning they have sprints, but the rest of the organization remains waterfall. There's still a requirements gathering phase and then a design phase. And so even though we say we work in sprints, that's very different from a true agile process. So there's a lot of waterfall still in large organizations. There's a lot of silos. There's people who do things that other parts of the organization don't know about. And then the last thing, and I've tried to find Keynote's most obnoxious animation for this. There we go. There's lots of bureaucracy. So what happens is that when we say we already know how to do this, it's because of these things. It's because there's so much isolation often in how enterprises are set up, and there's not enough knowledge sharing. So the problem becomes that we don't really know what we think we know. And the way to get around this is, and I like Clayton Christensen's view on this, he talks about what he calls discovery-based planning, which suggests that instead of saying we know what's right, we managers and anyone in these kind of positions going, we think we're wrong. Assume that forecasts are wrong rather than right, and that the strategy they have chosen to pursue may likewise be wrong. I always like to say, design like you're right, listen like you're wrong. Like when we design stuff and when we put things forward, do it with confidence based on the information you have. But then when you put it in front of users, listen like you're wrong. Like, and cultivate that in your organization to put things forward with confidence, but not to be too caught up in your own love for what you've created that you're not able to see that where you might be wrong and where you might change. So when it comes to this idea that we know what's right, a good antidote for that is to talk about discovery-based planning and how that results in better products. The third thing we often hear in enterprises for why we don't need research is we already know enough about users. We don't need to do anything more. But I like Erica Hall said this very well in an article she wrote. She said, the reason design projects that neglect research fail isn't because of a lack of knowledge, it's because of a lack of shared knowledge. And we see this so often is that when I do product discovery sessions and we bring a bunch of people together in a room, what I often find is everyone knows exactly what they think the user needs and what the product should do. The problem is they all have a completely different idea of what they think it should do. So everyone's sure of their knowledge, but it's different knowledge across the board. And that's something that's very important to explain to people in enterprise as well. Is you might know why something is happening, but if you don't share that with the team, we're not going to have a shared knowledge, and somewhere someone's going to get disappointed. So those are some of the reasons why it's really hard to do user research in enterprises. But we can't stop there. There must be a solution, and there is. So how do we sell the value of user research in enterprises? And what I found is particularly the kind of people who need to be convinced of this speak in different language. They want to know how much more money will this make us, and how much can it cut costs. So that's what we focus on, because we know the first thing, the way to sell research is that we know that it increases revenue. Doing research and design-based product design increases revenue. Here's something from the Design Management Institute that showed that the green line is companies that are considered design-based companies, and the black line is the S&P 500. And you see there's a much bigger return and revenue growth in design-focused companies that there is in other companies. And there's some solid research that's been done on this. So I think when we send out these are all hyperlinked, so when you get the slides, you'll be able to click through on this and see all of that. So that's the first thing. It increases revenue, but not just that, it reduces cost as well. If you look at a wonderful book called Software Engineering, a Practitioner's Approach, they did a lot of research about the cost of making changes. And if you look at the cost of making changes to a product during design as 1x, the cost of making those changes during development is 6x, and the cost of actually making those changes after launch is 100x. So the cost of making changes to a product after it's live and you hear from customers that it's not working is exponentially more expensive than taking a little time up front and making those changes during the design phase. And Marty Kagan has a great quote about this, and he says, "This is why it typically takes so many companies 3 or more releases over 1 to 2 years to get something usable and useful. They are using the engineering organization to build a very, very expensive prototype, and they use their live customers as unwitting test subjects." And the first time I read this, I got really sad, because I realized this is what we do. We might think we build production software and take 6 to 9 months to launch it, but we're actually taking 6 to 9 months to launch a prototype. And then instead of doing user testing, we're doing a very expensive live test with our customers. And we know that it's more expensive. We know it's 100 times more expensive to do this than to do research up front. And so this is the kind of language we can use to help sell why design and research up front is so important. And the third thing that we can use to sell user research is that it results in faster development cycles. And this becomes a little bit counterintuitive because of that first complaint we always hear, that it takes too long. And yes, it adds a week or 2 weeks to the development cycle. So how can we say it goes faster? But I do want to say that I think if research slows down the development process, you're doing it wrong. Like if research, if you look at a project long term and it takes longer with research, something went wrong along the process. Things might appear to move faster in the beginning, but as Job in Arrested Development might say, it's an illusion, Michael. When you think things move faster in the beginning, if you don't do research, that's all an illusion. I hope there's Arrested Development fans here. If not, then I still think it's funny. So it's all about having the right argument at the right time. And that's what this comes down to, and why I believe that you get faster development cycles with research is because you're having arguments at the right time. Now, there's this concept of big rocks and little rocks that comes from Stephen Covey's business books and stuff. And so I wanted to use that here. So all I want to say is don't Google big rocks, because you get some really, really weird illustrations across the web. And so I decided I kind of had to do my own, because this is all very, very strange. The concept is there, but I didn't find anything online that I would really want to use. So let's do something different. Let's talk about how a development process works if you don't do research, and the kind of issues that you address along the process. Now, I know this isn't perfect. This looks like a linear process, and it isn't, all of that stuff, sure. But let's just, for argument's sake, or for illustration's sake, say we have these different phases that you might go back and forth on. You have your IA and content strategy, prototyping, visual design, and development. If you don't do research, what starts to happen is you don't get feedback early on in the process. So by the time visual design rolls around, you're starting to find these big issues. But then you're already late in the process. And as you roll into development, you're starting to find more and more issues. And you're starting to have arguments about fundamentals that you should have had right in the beginning, but because there was no research involved and no cycles of prototyping and iterating, you continue to have a chaotic process that takes much longer than it should, because you're using your development cycle to sort out UX issues that should have been sorted out long ago. So how this works when you actually have research is there's always going to be big stuff to sort out. But if you do research first, you sort those out in the beginning, and by the time you get to development, you're fixing bugs or you're making final tweaks to things as you get into staging or whatever. Because you've used your time in the research to sort out the big rocks. And that's why I believe that development is faster when you make this part of your process, because you're spending the time that you argue about big things at the right time and the right fidelity, where it's cheap to make changes, as opposed to later on in the development process where it becomes really expensive. So start with questions instead of answers. Like, do not say that here's the visual design, let's start developing it. Start with, here's our hypothesis, we think this might work. Let's ask users in this early low fidelity phase if it might actually work. And then what we'll get to is a faster development cycle in the end. So those are the three things that we can use to sell enterprise research. It makes us more money, it costs less, and it goes faster. I don't know how anyone, as long as we're making a good argument, that's a pretty difficult argument to say, no, we don't want that. We want things to take longer and be more expensive. So moving on from that, let's then talk about how can we improve the insight generation that we actually have as we do user research in enterprises. And this might mean that we start small, like I said earlier, because we want to prove the concept. We want to prove that research actually makes things better. We might have to start small and go later on. So what makes enterprise research particularly interesting and different is that we have to plan for non-buyers. And the reason for this, what I mean by that, and the reason for this is that enterprise software works a little differently, as we all know. You have a piece of software. Hey kids, this is a floppy disk drive. We used to use this in the early days of computers. This used to be software, and this software is sold to executives and stakeholders and important people in a company with titles like CIO and CTO and CEO and COO. But they're used by very different people. They're used by people who have very different priorities, who they just want to get their work done. So even though the sales cycle in enterprise is managed in one way, because the people who make the decisions are interested in different things, they're used by different things. And I know I like to pick on HR systems, but that's a good example. No one, why does everyone buy Oracle, whatever it's called? Is because they went through these long cycles with leaders in the company and decided to buy it. And then everyone who has to actually submit a PTO request in there struggles because the enterprise is focused on building the product for who they're sold to, not how it's going to be used by. Those two people are not the same, and they have very different needs. And that's the issue here, is that people who you sell enterprise software to wants control, configurability, compliance. They want a specific set of features in a spreadsheet, whereas the people who use it just want to get stuff done. And those are very different needs and very different ways of looking at a product. And that's why it's important when we do research to not just go talk to the buyers, but talk to the people who would actually use the product. And the reason for this is that there is a death spiral in UX, in enterprise software. As fewer people are able to use the software, fewer people want to use it until no one uses it anymore. And we see this so often in intranets and things like that. When I was at Jive Software, I did a lot of interviews with people about, particularly we were working on a product that's supposed to be a better organizational chart to be able to see how you contact people. And everyone had an intranet where they could find that stuff. But in every single case, they didn't use it because it was too hard to use. And what they went back to is something that might sound familiar to you. If they want to look someone up, they would start Outlook, they would compose a new message, they would type someone's name into the new message, they would right click and then view the person's contact information and then see who they reported to and what their phone number is or whatever. And then they would close the email and never send it. That's what people do. And I wish I could see some nods. I usually see nods there, but that's what we do. We go to Outlook to look people up because there isn't a better way. And the other ways that have been provided for us in intranets are bad. And the reason it's bad is that it was sold to a different kind of person that's actually using it. So I think that's really important to talk to both of those users and explain to people why both are important. And second, write a concise research plan. And I know we always write research plans, but the reason I think this is particularly important is that if we don't get buy-in from everyone upfront about what the outcomes are going to be and what we're going to do with the information, it becomes, in the end, no matter how pretty your videos are and how good your deck is, it's going to sit somewhere and the product manager is going to say, yeah, that's nice, and then they're going to move on. So I see the research plan as a contract. It's a contract between you and the product manager and whoever the stakeholder is who sponsors the project to say, here's what we're going to do. This is the background of why we're doing this. This is the methodology and the schedule that we're using. Here are our goals, and these are the outcomes. These are the things we're going to do based on this information. When we're done, we need a list of things that we're going to change in the product, and we need to follow through on that. And the first time people see this, they might go, whoa, I just want to have the information. I'm not necessarily want to do something about it. And that's where the conversation starts and the contract starts coming in to say, if we're not going to do something with this information, we should rather save our money and not do it. And this contract, particularly in enterprise, becomes really important because there are so many PowerPoint decks that get opened once and then never again. And we need to define what are we going to do with this information once we have it. And it can be a simple paper doc. It doesn't have to be huge. This is just something that I recently did for one of ours. And you see here in the outcomes, we want a list of prioritized changes we need to make to improve the feature. That's the outcome. And we're going to make those changes. And that needs to be the contract, and everyone needs to sign off on that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is focus on core methods. I think as researchers, I shouldn't say all of us. I won't include you in all that. But for me, it was always I wanted to try new methods. I really love participatory design, so I wanted to do that a lot. And there's all these kind of different things that I want to do. But I realized, particularly in enterprise, the core methods are what's really important. So if we go back to NN Group's definition of what makes a useful product, it needs to have both utility and usability. And particularly in the enterprise, we tend to focus on only one of these. We don't do both. So we tend to do usability testing, but never figure out if it's actually a useful product, or we try to figure out if it's a useful product and then skip out on the usability. And when I mean core methods, I mean is make sure that we cover both of our bases here. So we have to uncover unmet needs with exploratory research, field visits, concept design, that kind of stuff. And we have to refine the product through design research with usability testing, right tracking, whatever it might be. And then we have to measure our success. So the stuff that we do have to fit in here, and we have to realize that when we, particularly in larger projects, when we do research and what kind of methodologies we use are really important here. And because they do different things. We can't say, okay, we did exploratory research, so we're good. Or we can't just say, well, we did usability testing because we're good. Because yeah, the product might be usable, but if no one wants it, then it's going to be a failure as well. So this is another important thing to understand and explain to people in enterprises, that we need to have a combination of exploratory and design research during our design process to make sure that we build useful products. And then fourth, record and document. And I know we do this all in our own way, but what I found is it's really important to show people the process that we use, because there's still a lot of skepticism in that, whether this is actually science. I mean, I've been in a lot of meetings where people say, okay, we can do the research, but then we should also get real data, meaning, you know, Google Analytics and stuff like that. So there's still this idea that this user research isn't real data. It's nice. And a way for us to get beyond that is to show that we're not just pulling the stuff out of nowhere. We're actually there's an analysis process, and there's a reason we do things. So record sessions, like here's us recording, not just recording the mobile session, but also having photos of the people who are doing the sessions to show we talk to our actual users and they use this thing. Make notes, and again, put photos of these notes in your presentations. I know it sounds silly, but I find it really helps for people to realize, okay, there's some thought in here, and show your work. Here, like this is another photo I put in an actual presentation showing how I did affinity diagramming and how I used that to combine different issues. And this is important, again, because it shows people that what we're doing is real data. It's not like this is kind of stuff that we can do and then the real data comes later. This is real data. I would even show things like mind maps that I've made along the way. Again, not to show, hey, it's very important to frame this right. You're not convincing people that you're actually doing work and not just sitting at your desk. You're using this to show people that there is a methodology that is scientifically feasible, that we're following, and so we can trust this data because of the process that we followed throughout it. And maybe you don't have to do it every single time, but I think the first few times you do this and show this kind of work, it builds trust in the data that you present to people. So to come back to the beginning in our space story, first imagine that this is you had to fly to the moon like this, which doesn't sound very comfortable. But the reason I started with the moon example and want to come back to it is that these enterprise projects are hard, but there are ways for us to design them right. And when we design them right, there are ways for us to have real impact in organizations. We might not be able to land people on the moon, but we can have our own idea of what that might be, of making a real impact in how we design things. And I think these things go really fast when you're on a webinar type thing, but that was the end of that. I don't. Should I stop sharing, Ben? Like, how do we go from here?
Hey Ryan, that was fantastic. I think no, I think you can just leave it on this slide here, and we can get through some of the questions. We've got a lot of questions here. So
okay,
here let me drop in the URL to the ebook that you helped write for us here, so people know that if they want to really dive into this further, Ryan wrote I think it was like a 40-something page ebook that really dives into some of the methodologies that he practices. So it really goes into the guts of enterprise UX research more. And of course, this is free to download. And here is the URL that I just dropped there if you want to really get into this deep. Let's see here. So I'm going to run this quick poll here. And again, I apologize if you've taken this poll before. I've told Zoom that they should sort of filter out people who've taken the poll before so they don't have to keep taking it. But this is very useful for us for the content that we've done. And yeah, let's get right into the questions here. So there's definitely some interest in user research recruitment in the enterprise. And I know this is something you sort of covered in the ebook, but for instance, if somebody is working with very specialized users, let's say accountants in this role, right? How can they still run lean user research? Because in this case, you can't really just go to a coffee shop and expect those people will match your desired user base. So in your experience, when you've worked with very advanced or almost niche users, how do you get access to these end users in a large enterprise?
Yeah, so that's a good point. What's good about, or the good part about that is, yes, you can go to a coffee shop, but when it comes to really specialized users like that, I find that the more specialized it becomes, you have more access to them personally to be able to email them. And what I found is that you don't go to a coffee shop, but you do a Skype session or a Zoom session or whatever it might be. And I found that if you're able to even use your existing customers as proxies for new customers, the fact that you can go to your existing customers is something you can do still very much on the cheap, either through one of the online user research platforms, or I just prefer to do it from my desk with a Skype session because it's so cheap.
Gotcha. And how do you find those end users, for instance? Do you go through the organization to find them? Do you go on LinkedIn to try to find people who match that background?
Well, you presumably have a product that have users, and I'm proposing going to those users. So either talking to your sales or customer support organizations internally to find lists of your own customers who you're able to talk to.
Gotcha. And when you're in a project, what does the schedule of user research generally look like? So for instance, does that mean you do user research up front and then you also do usability testing throughout? Maybe you can give people an idea of what that sort of research and testing schedule cadence feels like.
Yeah, it depends on so many variables, right? So if it's a large project that you're kicking off, I really like to start with product discovery and understand. I should maybe put a link to my product discovery article in here as well. But start with that kind of process to understand what we already know about our users, and using that to figure out what information we still need. So if you don't have enough information from users about what you need, yes, you might do a round of user interviews first, and then the usability testing later on. If you already know enough about users, you might start a first prototype, very low fidelity prototype, and use that as your first research. I usually hope, it's not a specific rule or anything, but I try to do on bigger project at least 2 research sessions 3 to 4 weeks apart. So that would either be a exploratory research session and a design research sessions, or two design research sessions. So maybe one on a prototype and one on a beta version or a version that's on staging somewhere.
Right. And somebody actually has a really good question here about how that information gets shared and democratized within a large enterprise, right? So in your experience, have you used any particular tools or any particular processes to make sure that all this user research that gets captured over months and years of time doesn't just slip through the cracks of the enterprise, that it actually sits somewhere and people will access and they will digest this information?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing there is the relationship and not where you put it, and that's why I'm so adamant about the contract, the goals that you have up front. why I think it's so important for researchers to have a good relationship with their product managers who are going to make those decisions. I think where you put it is you don't put it in your favorite place. You put it in wherever people are. So if you use Basecamp or if you use SharePoint and that's where people are, that's where you put the information. But the thing is, I think if you have to put the information somewhere and hope someone finds it, that you've lost already. I think the way to have this really permeate the organization is to make sure that the results that you bring in are actionable and you're going to make changes based on that, and you are sitting with your product manager to understand that and get those changes into the development cycle. Because if it has to be looked at a month later, you're already too late. You have to be part of that team, and so that's why I feel like the relationship is so much more important than the PowerPoint presentation itself.
Right, right. And actually, if you wouldn't mind, somebody here was curious if you could go to slide number, I think it's the one that shows how you sketch out your user interviews. So if you go, I think it's like 43.
Is it this one?
Yeah, it's actually that one.
43.
If you could just,
this one?
Yeah, that one. If you could just describe a little bit more, how do you sort of analyze and also document these user interviews, and maybe walk through a little bit what this document is and how do you use this?
Sure. So I wrote a post about this that I'll find and post as well, but this is my preferred way for taking notes when you don't have a note taker. So how this is set up, every project will be different. This is because it's based on user journeys. So I would create a user journey. In this case, it was interviews with radio producers. And how they put shows on the radio. So you see it at the top. It says collect stories, choose stories, prepare for the show, do the show, and post-show admin. So that's the user journey that I go through based on interviews with stakeholders. So every interview I did, I made sure that I made notes based on our conversation and the interview in each of the sections of the user journey. And that was immediately a way to make it easier to do the analysis, because you already have these original groupings. And then within the user journey, there are then groupings that come out, and what are the issues with collecting stories? What are the issues with choosing them and preparing for the show? But it helps to, instead of having just a notebook where you write things down, it helps having a larger one like this horizontally, where you just fit things in based on where you are in the interview.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting how you sort of how you use that customer journey as kind of a blueprint that you then fill in as as you talk to people. You sort of have this sort of skeleton that you can just flesh out.
So I just found, this was a long time ago. So I'll paste I have that, just posted that in there, where I explain this a little bit more.
Gotcha. And now we've got another question here that really is focusing on stakeholders in the beginning of the research process. So, you mentioned how it's really important for people to almost assume that the forecasts are probably going to be incorrect. So how do you kind of get this idea better accepted in an enterprise? So how do you ensure that these stakeholders can accept they don't fully understand the problem at the early stages? Because it's so easy for them to just think they understand, but they discover the gaps later. So to kind of introduce this, mentality of looking at everything with fresh eyes.
Yeah, I think there are two ways. The first ideal way, although it's kind of sad, but there are in most enterprises examples of a product or a project that failed. And when you look at it, it usually failed because of a lack of user understanding. So if you can show, first of all, how an assumption that we knew what we were doing resulted in a failed project internally, that that helps a lot. If that hasn't happened, the other option is to look outside. And I don't know how many people are on here and how many people might work for examples. I might use, so I'd rather not. But um, there are lots of examples externally of products that failed, and the reason they fail is because of this. And speaking of that, the other article I will post here is I mentioned product discovery a couple times, and I just posted an article I wrote about that and what I mean by that. Yeah.
Gotcha. And then someone was curious: is there a kind of go-to toolbox of user research and user testing methods that you try to run for every project? Are there any sort of preferred methods that you have found work really well in the enterprise?
Yeah, so there's two things I'll say to that. The first one is is it okay if I post links in here? Is that how this works?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to drop as many links as you like.
So the first link here is a great book on this called Observing the User Experience, Practitioner's Guide to User Research. It's really pricey, but it's get your enterprise to buy it for you. But it goes through basically all the UX specific user research methods, and it's really good. For me personally, what I like to do a combination of interviews and usability testing. So interviews ideally in person where people do their work, but otherwise phone is fine. So exploratory research in terms of not asking them questions about an interface, but asking, getting to the job to be done of the thing. So job to be done interviews, and then usability testing, task-based. So and observing user experiences and doing it task-based.
Gotcha. Let's see here. So the next question here is around how do you sort of digest and start mapping out and analyzing all this qualitative information? Is there, maybe you can walk us through your process of kind of uncovering the patterns and then helping to visualize it in a way that non-designers and both designers can understand and also act on that information?
Yeah, so the slide I'm on now is an example of that. I'm just a huge fan of affinity diagramming and using it specifically with actual sticky notes on a whiteboard. So what I would do is, with the team who was with me, is we would go through our notes of every single interview after the interview, and just writing insights down, writing things down that are important to us. And you end up with 100, 200 sticky notes on a whiteboard, and then the affinity diagram process works that you start to look for patterns in that. So you spend time on your feet looking at it and starting to group things together, as you see here, and starting to group them together and in a specific theme. And then what I like to do after this is to again map this to the user journey that you have. We didn't talk much about customer journeys today, but I think that's an essential part of this as well. Mapping the issues to whatever customer journey you're working on to provide a framework for that. But I always start the analysis with affinity diagramming.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a very practical process there. And we've got another question here. So, so somebody here says, he faces several layers of stakeholders between himself and the actual end user. So he's got general managers, business analysts, product managers, etc. And that ends up forming a barrier to getting research actually done quickly. Have you encountered this situation before? And if so, what were some of the steps you took to get around that?
Yeah, so the relationship is important, and the product discovery is a secret tool in that. So just maybe I posted the article, but just a little bit about product discovery. It's a kickoff session you have with particularly in an enterprise, a subset of people who are responsible. So you would have always someone from sales, someone from marketing, someone from biz dev, someone from whoever, who represents their team and will have input on the project. And you use that session, which is usually a day or two, to understand what do we already know about our customers, what's the problem we're trying to solve for them, all that kind of stuff. And what usually happens is that those people become your allies. Because once they go through this process, even if they're at first really upset that someone told them to sit in a room for a day or two, it always works out well, and they become allies in understanding what you're trying to do and that you're all on the same team. So what happens is you build this relationship with someone in sales or in biz dev or wherever who removes some of those barriers and are able to connect you with customers, or at the very least give you better insight into what they know about end users. And it's really useful for them to see the other side of things as well, the technology side, the user research side, whatever, marketing side, whatever it might be. So having that core team that is actually representative of the entire company is really important. You don't want 20 people in that meeting, you want eight or so, but it's important for there to be a representative of particularly those areas that you see as barriers.
Right, right. And we have another question here, which is, have you ever done any sort of pure observation only research to just understand what enterprise users already do in their existing domain or their legacy systems, whether that's field visits or some sort of I know there's a lot of different kind of what is it, like click tracking and heat mapping software out there
Yeah.
for different products. Yeah, have you done any of those tactics? And if so, could you kind of describe what you did?
Yeah, so the example I used for the product we built as a better way to look at your org chart and your company was one of those where I did a bunch of interviews with people at their places of work and just asking them, without introducing a new product, show me how you do this. How do you look people up? What are some of the things that you that are important to you as you do that? So they would show me Outlook. They would show me their internal intranet, those kind of things. In terms of tools that we use for without direct contact, I'm actually a big fan of FullStory, which you can set up to collect full user sessions. So for example, when we do A/B testing on sign-up forms or stuff like that, we're able to see not just does one perform better than the other, but where do people get stuck in the form. We can just review those sessions in FullStory. So that's another tool I really like.
Gotcha. And the next question here is, so obviously in the enterprise you want to test with end users, but have you ever tested products on the buyers, or how are the buyers' needs sort of accounted for and validated in the enterprise alongside the end users?
So the buyer side is interesting because it's usually their decision usually has nothing to do with the interaction with the product itself. So there's that's the other reason why I think that someone from the sales team, if there is such a thing, needs to be involved throughout the project and the product discovery of it, because they know what those people's needs are. So they provide that countermeasure, a counterpoint for what's important to them as you propose changes to the product. Like you can't take this thing away because the buyer really needs it, that kind of stuff. So I think you talk less to them because they are less involved in the interactions day to day, but their views are represented through whoever has the most contact with them.
Gotcha. The next question here is about, let's see here. I had this for a second. All right. The next question here is about keeping biases in mind from affecting the qualitative data. Has that ever been a concern when you're doing research, keeping your own thought processes, your goals, and your biases separate from the research that you're conducting? And if so, what are some ways that somebody can manage that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's really important, even though it's not always possible, is that the designer shouldn't do the research. So I've always tried to keep that separate. Like when I design stuff, have someone else do the research, because your ego is less involved if you separate those things out. But then also, I think it comes with practice, but just as you write out your script, teaching yourself to not lead with a question, and particularly with user research, staying observational and behavioral as opposed to attitudinal. So staying away from questions, or steering a little bit away from questions like, do you like this, or what do you think of this, and more questions like, how would you do this, what do you think is going to happen next. Those are the kinds of things that become observations as opposed to feelings that are much easier to reflect your own biases as you're talking to someone.
Right, right. And let's see here. I think we'll take one more question, since we're pushing up on the hour here. Thanks everybody for all these fantastic questions. All right, so let's see. The last question we have is, let's take a look, is maybe you could discuss a little bit more detail how you have tied user research back to monetary value for like specific instances, because it seems like there could be a lot of factors that can influence a company's bottom line, and sometimes it might be hard to necessarily pin a certain value or a certain decision to user research. So how in your past experience have you managed to really kind of just focus the lens there and get really close to a sort of correlation between user research and then value to the organization?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it is a little bit removed, unfortunately. But the thing to do is to before you set off on a project, whether that's a redesign or something completely new, is to define your success metrics up front, and that's usually something that the product manager does. But just to push them on that, to make sure, okay, this is part of the product discovery process, by the way, is to say, how will we know this project was a success? And defining that and making sure that you have your benchmarks before you start, and then hopefully adding or making sure that one of those measures of success include a user experience or a research type of thing, in terms of whether that's a completion rate or an improvement or a reduction in drop-off, or whatever that might be, that you can link back directly to your UX efforts. So these projects usually have different key results related to different areas that are involved in them. So yeah, there might be a revenue goal that's harder to link back directly to the research, but you could link the research to something like a reduction in drop-off rate, which you could then argue relates back to the revenue target. Right. So I think it's building those success metrics into the process up front while you're working on that contract, so to speak, with the product manager.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with that being said, everybody, thank you so much for all the great questions and for joining us today. Rian, thank you for the fantastic presentation here. Everybody seemed to really enjoy it, and yeah, the reception has been great. I think you had up to 1,400 people here live for your session. Yeah,
I'm glad you didn't tell me that before.
Yeah, no, I figured I was waiting till the end. I was like, I don't want to psych them out here.
Yeah.
But yeah, everybody found it really useful and inspiring at the same time, and a lot of different questions here that unfortunately we couldn't get to all of them. But for folks, just a few closing notes. So if you want to follow along on the conversation on Twitter, we are at #EUX Summit 2017. And if you have more than 3 years of experience in a product team, we encourage you to apply to our Slack team, which is Product Tribes. I'm going to drop the link here as well. And one last note, all of the sessions will be sent and to your email next week, so you guys will be able to get that information here. And of course, Rian's excellent book on product management and user research is Making It Right, and that is available on Amazon And here is the link for that. Let me drop that in here as well. Yeah, it's a very compact but very useful and practical book, and so definitely worth getting. And other than that, the next session we are going to start in 15 minutes is a product demo for UXPin, where we dive deeper into our high fidelity prototyping capabilities. So again, just to clarify, that is a product demo. So if you think that UXPin might be useful for your organization, or if you're interested in seeing how it can help you with high fidelity prototyping, we encourage you to join. Otherwise, no worries. You can join us in the afternoon. We have 2 more sessions from some great speakers. And here is the URL for the product demo that is starting in about 12 minutes now. Otherwise, thanks everybody. And yeah, Rian, great job. And we will catch you guys in the afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep, take care.